There was a man in this town who almost never spoke, not because he couldn't, not because he was shy, or broken, or afraid. He just chose silence, the way other people choose words, and for most of his life, that silence cost him everything. His relationships, his opportunities, his sense of self-worth. One by one, they slipped through his fingers like water, and he stood there, watching, unable to explain why he couldn't just open his mouth and say something, anything. People called him cold, distant, odd. Some felt uncomfortable around him. Others simply stopped trying. And after enough rejections, enough rooms that went quiet in the wrong way when he walked in, he started to believe them. Maybe I'm just not made for connection. Maybe some people are meant to live on the edges of other people's lives. But here's what nobody saw. Here's what nobody knew. Years later, that same quiet man would walk into a room, and without raising his voice, without performing, without pretending to be something he wasn't, every single person there would stop and listen. Not because he demanded it, because something in him had changed so fundamentally, so deeply, that his very presence said what his words never could. This is the story of how that happened, and it might be the most important story you hear this year. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you watching this right now? Are you in your bed with the lights off, sitting in your car after a long day? Maybe in a quiet room, trying to make sense of something you can't quite name? Drop it in the comments. Just tell me where you are. Because I genuinely believe this story found you for a reason. And I want to know who's in this room with me tonight. And if you're new here, and this is the first time something on this channel has stopped your scroll, consider subscribing. These stories come from a quiet place, and they're made for people who feel things deeply. Now, let's begin. His name was Daniel. He was 31 years old. By every external measure, his life was fine. He had a decent job doing data analysis for a mid-size company. He had an apartment that was always clean because no one ever visited. He had a sister who called on Sundays and a mother who worried in the way only mothers can. Quietly, persistently, across every phone call and holiday dinner. He was, by most definitions, stable. But stability and aliveness are not the same thing. And Daniel had not felt truly alive in a very long time. Every morning looked the same. The alarm at 6:45. Coffee, black, standing at the counter because sitting down felt like committing to the day. The 20-minute drive to work with the radio off. Not because he hated music, but because silence was the only space that felt honest. At work, he sat at his desk and did his job well. Exceptionally even. His numbers were always right. His reports were always clean. His manager respected him in that distant professional way that doesn't cross into warmth. But in meetings, Daniel said almost nothing. Not because he had nothing to offer. His mind was constantly working, noticing patterns others missed, forming connections no one else had made, building quiet observations into something worth saying. But by the time he found the words, the moment had always passed. Someone else had already spoken. The conversation had already moved. And Daniel would sit back in his chair and feel the familiar sinking. That slow, heavy feeling of watching life happen from just outside the glass. After work, he went home. He ate dinner alone, always something simple, always enough. He read, he sat by the window, and watched the street. Sometimes he'd write long paragraphs in a notebook that no one would ever read, thoughts that were sharp and honest and human and completely invisible to the world. He went to bed. He did it all again. This was his life, and the single core problem, the wound that ran beneath everything else, was this. Daniel did not believe his presence mattered. Not his silence, not his words, not his thoughts, not his existence in a room. He believed somewhere so deep he'd stopped questioning it, that he simply did not register, that he was the kind of person the world moved around without noticing. And so, he had stopped trying to be noticed. He had made peace with the edge, or so he told himself. But peace and numbness are not the same thing either. On a Thursday evening in late October, Daniel sat in the parking lot after work for 22 minutes before he could bring himself to start the car. He didn't know why. He just sat there, hands in his lap, watching the streetlights flicker on, one by one, as the sky went dark. And the thoughts came, the ones he usually managed to keep quiet. Why am I like this? Other people don't have to work this hard just to exist in a room. And other people don't have to rehearse sentences in their heads before they speak. Other people laugh easily, connect easily, leave impressions without even trying. Why can't I just be normal? Why does it feel like I've been watching my own life through a window for 31 years? And then, the quietest thought, the most honest one. Maybe this is just who I am. Maybe I was made for this. For watching, for the edge, for the corner of every room. Maybe the most realistic thing I can do is just accept it. He started the car. He drove home, in the dark. And that night, he didn't read. He didn't write. He just lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling for a long time. There was something deeply exhausting about carrying a version of yourself that nobody else could see. The moment that changed everything happened on a Friday, an ordinary Friday, in the most ordinary way. The company had a new hire, a young woman named Claire, who was 24 and had the kind of easy warmth that filled a room before she even spoke. She'd been there 2 weeks. Already, everyone loved her. At lunch, a small group gathered in the break room. Daniel was there because he needed coffee, and stayed because leaving felt more conspicuous than staying. Claire was talking about something that had happened to her as a kid. A small story, funny and warm. People were laughing. Then she looked across the table directly at Daniel, not past him, not through him, at him. And she said simply, genuinely, "What do you think, Daniel?" The room didn't stop. Nobody held their breath. It was a normal question. But Daniel felt it land somewhere deep in his chest, because she had said his name. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like of course she wanted to know what he thought. Like of course his voice belonged in this room. He opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Claire smiled, not unkindly, not with pity, just warmly. She moved the conversation gently on. But Daniel stood at the coffee machine for a long moment after everyone left. His hand was trembling slightly, not from fear, from something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Grief. Grief for every room he had sat in and made himself smaller. Grief for every thought he had let die in silence. Grief for the version of himself that might have existed if he had ever once believed he was worth listening to. He went home that night and opened his notebook, and for the first time, instead of writing about the world outside his window, he wrote about himself. "I think I've been disappearing for so long, I forgot it was a choice." 3 weeks later, Daniel signed up for a community class. Not public speaking. He couldn't bring himself to that yet. A philosophy discussion group that met on Wednesday evenings in the back room of a local library. He almost didn't go the first night. He sat in his car for 11 minutes. Then he went in. The group was led by a man named Arthur, 70 years old, white hair, hands that moved slowly when he spoke, like every gesture had been considered. He had the quality of someone who had spent a very long time learning how to be present. Arthur didn't run the group like a teacher. He asked questions and then went quiet. Long, unhurried quiet. The kind that made you realize silence wasn't empty. It was full of things people hadn't said yet. After the third session, Daniel stayed to help stack chairs. Arthur looked at him with calm, clear eyes and said, "You think a great deal. I can see it in the way you listen." Daniel didn't know what to say. Arthur continued, unhurried. "Most people listen to respond. You listen to understand. That's rare, but you've confused depth with invisibility. They're not the same thing." Daniel set down the chair in his hands. "I don't know how to be in a room," he said quietly. It was the most honest thing he'd said to another person in years. Arthur looked at him for a moment. "You already are," he said. "You've just been apologizing for it." The following Wednesday, Arthur arrived with something unusual: a small glass of water and a stone. He set them on the table and asked the group what they saw. People said different things. A rock and a still water. Simplicity. Arthur dropped the stone in. The ripples moved outward, slow, even quiet, touching every edge of the glass. "The stone doesn't shout," Arthur said. "It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. It simply enters the water fully, with its whole weight, and the water responds." He looked around the room. Presence is not volume. It is not performance. It is not the number of words you use or how quickly you speak. Presence is simply the willingness to arrive, fully, honestly, without apology, and trust that the water will respond. Daniel stared at the ripples until they stilled. He had spent 31 years trying to make himself smaller so the water wouldn't notice him. He had never once considered simply letting himself drop. In the weeks that followed, Arthur gave Daniel 3 principles, not rules, not techniques, just 3 quiet truths to carry. 1. Arrive before you speak. Be in the room before you open your mouth. Feel the floor under your feet. Breathe. Let your presence settle. Most people speak to prove they exist. Arrive first, then speak only what's true. 2. Your depth is not a defect. The world will try to make you feel broken for thinking slowly, for feeling deeply, for needing silence. It isn't weakness. It is the shape of your mind. Stop apologizing for it. Start using it. 3. Consistency is a form of presence. Show up. Keep showing up. Not dramatically, not loudly, just reliably, honestly, again and again. Over time, consistency becomes the loudest thing in any room. 3 principles. That was the whole system. Simple, quiet, real. Daniel broke it down into what he could actually do. Every morning, 10 minutes of sitting in stillness before he touched his phone. Not meditation exactly, just arriving in the day before the day arrived in him. At work, 1 genuine comment per meeting, not a performance, just 1 honest observation offered calmly, without apology. Wednesday evenings at Arthur's group, non-negotiable. No excuses, no skipping because the couch was comfortable. And every night, 2 pages in his notebook. Not about the world outside, about the world inside. That was it. 4 small things, repeated. Not a revolution, a practice. He failed at it constantly. There were mornings the stillness felt pointless, and he grabbed his phone after 90 seconds. There were meetings where he formed the perfect thought and then let it die because the moment felt wrong, or the voice in his head said, "Nobody wants to hear this." There were Wednesday evenings he drove to the library and then sat in the parking lot and drove home again. But he always came back. That was the difference. Not that he was perfect, not that it was easy, but that he kept returning to the practice the way you return to a quiet room you've made a habit of. Not because you always want to, but because you know what it does for you over time. Some nights, he wrote in his notebook with his jaw tight and his eyes burning. I don't know if this is working. I don't feel different. I still sit in rooms and disappear. But he kept writing. He kept arriving. He kept dropping the stone into the water again and again, trusting in something he couldn't yet see. Days passed, then weeks. 2 months later, Daniel gave a full 2-minute contribution in a team meeting. Nobody applauded, and nobody made a big deal. But his manager looked at him afterward and said, "That was a good point." Daniel carried that home like something fragile and precious. 4 months later, he was attending the philosophy group with something approaching ease. He still spoke less than most, but when he did speak, people leaned in, slightly, without knowing why, because his words arrived with weight behind them, the weight of someone who had considered them carefully and chosen them honestly. 8 months later, he called his sister on a Tuesday, not Sunday, just because he wanted to. They talked for an hour. She cried a little near the end and said she'd missed him. He didn't know what to say. So he just said, "I'm coming back." 1 year later, Daniel was barely recognizable, not on the outside. He still wore the same kind of clothes. He still took his coffee black, still preferred the corner of the room when he first arrived somewhere new. But something in the quality of his silence had shifted. It was no longer the silence of someone trying not to be seen. It was the silence of someone who had chosen to be present. At a company meeting, full staff, 70 people, a new director presenting a strategy that had some quiet problems Daniel could clearly see, something happened. His manager looked around the room and said, "Does anyone have thoughts?" The room was still. Daniel breathed. He felt the floor under his feet. He let his presence settle. And then calmly, without apology, without performance, he spoke. He spoke for 4 minutes. Clear, measured, precise. He named the problems. He offered a different direction. He didn't rush. He didn't perform certainty he didn't have. When he finished, the room was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of before, the quiet of people thinking. The director nodded slowly. "That's worth exploring," she said. Afterward, Claire, who still worked there, still brought warmth into every room she entered, stopped him in the hallway. "You've changed," she said. "I mean that in the best way." Daniel thought for a moment. "I stopped disappearing," he said. She smiled. "Yeah, we noticed. Here is what I want you to take from this." Daniel's problem was never that he was too quiet. It was that he had confused silence with absence. He believed that if he wasn't loud, he wasn't there. If he wasn't performing, he wasn't worthy. If he wasn't the first to speak, there was no room for him. But presence has never been about volume. Oh, it's about weight. It's about the willingness to arrive, fully, honestly, without apology. And trust that the people around you will feel it. Not because you demand to be felt, but because something true always registers. You might be sitting somewhere right now feeling like Daniel felt, like the room moves around you, but not because of you, like your thoughts are invisible, like you are just slightly outside of your own life. I want to say something directly to you. That feeling is not evidence of who you are. It is evidence of a habit you have practiced for a very long time. And habits can be changed. Not overnight, not loudly, not with a single decision, but slowly, consistently. One morning at a time. One honest moment at a time. The stone doesn't shout. It simply enters the water with its whole weight. And the water always responds. So here is your challenge. Tomorrow morning, before your phone, before the noise, before the day swallows you whole, sit in stillness for 10 minutes. Just 10. Feel where you are. Breathe into the room. Arrive in yourself. before you try to arrive anywhere else. Then come here and tell me in the comments, what is one room in your life where you've been making yourself smaller than you are? It could be work, home, a relationship, a friendship, a version of yourself you've been waiting for permission to show. Write it down. Say it out loud. Let the water know you're there. And if this story reached something in you tonight, something quiet and real, share it with someone who needs it. You probably already know exactly who that person is. This channel exists for the people who feel things deeply and don't always have words for it. If that's you, you're home. Subscribe and stay a while. The next story is already waiting.